Before we begin, a quick reminder. If you enjoy mysterious stories of nobility, power, and the secrets hidden in Europe's past, don't forget to subscribe to History One, so you'll always be here when the next tale is unveiled. The night the Duke's heir vanished was one of those nights that seemed to be written in the stars, as though fate had dipped its quill into ink blacker than midnight. The castle of Ravenspire, perched on the mist-shrouded cliffs of Normandy, had long been a place whispered about in taverns and noble courts alike. Some said its halls were cursed, others that its stones remembered every oath broken and every secret whispered in shadow. Yet no rumor had ever matched the horror of that evening, when the boy who was destined to inherit one of the most powerful duchies in France disappeared without a trace. No servant saw him leave, no guard heard the creak of a door, and no horse was missing from the stables. His bed was found untouched, the sheets still neat, as if he had dissolved into the air itself. But the castle held more secrets than its lords ever dared confess, and as whispers spread across Europe, from the salons of Paris to the candlelit courts of Vienna, a single question lingered like incense after a funeral mass. Was the disappearance of the Duke's heir an act of betrayal, sorcery, or a conspiracy woven at the highest levels of power? The story that follows does not come from official chronicles, for those were scrubbed clean by men in velvet cloaks and with wax seals of authority. Instead, it comes from hidden letters, forgotten diaries, and testimonies whispered before deathbeds, pieces of a truth that, once assembled, reveal a darkness far deeper than anyone ever imagined. It begins, not with the boy's vanishing, but with the tangled roots of a family whose nobility was built as much on blood as on ambition. For the House of Beaufort, the family of the missing heir was no stranger to scandal, nor to the silent erasure of those who stood in their way. The year was 1693, when Louis XIV still reigned as the Sun King, casting his golden light across France, though his radiance often blinded men to the shadows growing at their feet. The Duke of Beaufort was one of the king's most trusted allies, wealthy, ambitious, and ruthless in equal measure. His loyalty had bought him privilege at court, yet behind the gilded doors of Versailles, whispers followed him like a trail of smoke, whispers of bribes, clandestine affairs, and debts that could ruin even the proudest house. His heir, young Adrien de Beaufort, was barely 12 years old when the storm began to gather. A quiet boy with an unsettling gaze, Adrien was said to wander the castle at night, staring at paintings as though the ancestors within would one day speak to him. He had been educated by the finest tutors in Paris, taught Latin, fencing, and courtly grace, but what unsettled the household most was his fascination with secrets. Adrien was known to slip into the servants' quarters unannounced, asking questions about locked rooms, hidden passages, and who visited the Duke's chambers in the dead of night. Some claimed he once uncovered a priest's hidden ledger of confessions. Others swore he found a sealed letter from the king himself, written in a cipher that none but Adrien seemed to recognize. Whether the tales were true or not, one thing was certain. Adrien had inherited not only his father's sharp mind, but also the fatal curiosity that had undone so many nobles before him. On the eve of his disappearance, the boy had been seen in the library, poring over a tattered folio bound in dark leather. The book was not part of the Duke's official collection. It bore no crest, no name, and its pages smelled faintly of smoke. A servant later testified that Adrien's lips moved as he read, whispering words that chilled the air. But when morning came, the book was gone, and so was the boy. The Duke raged, threatening the staff with the gallows, but no clue surfaced. No ransom note was delivered, no sighting was reported. The heir to one of the richest duchies in France had vanished as though swallowed by the very stones of Ravenspire. And yet, a week later, a letter arrived not to the Duke, but to his estranged cousin in Vienna. Sealed with black wax and bearing no name, it read only, "The blood of Beaufort stains more than France. The boy knows what should never be known." The Duke's cousin in Vienna, Count Matthias von Hohenberg, was not easily rattled. He had grown up amidst the chaos of the 30 Years' War, had seen towns burned and noble lines extinguished in a single season. Yet when he broke the black wax and read the letter, His hand trembled so violently that the candle beside him spilled its wax across the table. For Matthias knew of secrets buried deep in the bloodline of the Dufort, secrets older than Ravenspire Castle itself. The boy's disappearance was not the first mystery to haunt their house. Generations earlier, during the plague years, 2 heirs had vanished without explanation, their names erased from official records as if they had never existed. Matthias's grandmother had whispered once, in a fit of fever, that the Duforts had made a pact with powers not meant to be named in holy company. It was why their lands had prospered while villages all around starved, why their coffers remained heavy even after wars drained others dry. Still, Matthias had dismissed such tales as the delirium of old age until the letter arrived. Now, his mind returned to those hushed words. The boy knows what should never be known. Meanwhile, back at Ravenspire, silence was enforced with the precision of a blade. Servants were forbidden to speak of Adrian's disappearance beyond the castle walls. The Duke, red-faced with fury, declared that the heir had been sent to a monastery for education, though no one believed him. The Duchess, pale as marble, refused to leave her chambers, her ladies-in-waiting reporting muffled sobs behind the velvet curtains. And in the village below, peasants swore they saw lights in the castle towers long past midnight, as if figures moved restlessly through corridors once thought abandoned. Rumors spread like wildfire, as they always do where truth is forbidden. Some said gypsies had stolen the boy, others that English spies had kidnapped him to weaken the French nobility. But there were darker whispers too, whispers of secret rites performed in the catacombs beneath Ravenspire, of voices chanting in Latin long after the chapel bells had ceased to ring. One servant, a young maid named Isabel, vanished herself a month after Adrian. Her absence was hardly remarked upon by the Duke, yet the villagers remembered her as a girl with quick laughter and quicker feet. Her brother, a blacksmith, swore he saw her ghost wandering near the cliffside at dusk, her white shift glowing in the mist. When he called out to her, she turned, and her eyes were black as coal. At court in Versailles, Louis XIV demanded explanations. The disappearance of a ducal heir was not a matter to be concealed, for every noble child was part of the great chessboard of alliances and inheritances. The Duke arrived, bowing low, insisting that Adrian was safe in the care of holy men. Yet the king's gaze was sharp, and behind the gold of his attire, he understood too well the stink of a lie. But Louis had his own secrets to protect. Versailles itself was a labyrinth of intrigue, with letters passing hand to hand, bribes flowing like wine, and nobles whispering against one another behind painted fans. The Duke's disgrace could be used, but not yet. For if the boy truly had uncovered something, it might threaten not only the House of Dufort, but the throne itself. So the Sun King smiled, raised his jeweled hand, and declared the matter closed. Behind closed doors, however, the Duke received a different message. An Gaverican unsigned note slipped beneath his chamber door read, "If you wish to see your son again, return what was taken in 1629. The dead remember, even if you do not." 1629, the year of the Great Fire of Ravenspire, when the west wing of the castle had been reduced to rubble. Officially, it was said that lightning struck the tower during a storm, but those who had survived whispered that the fire began not in the sky, but in the vaults below, where forbidden objects had been kept under lock and chain. No one spoke of it since. Yet now, the shadow of that year had returned, clawing its way back into the present. And if the boy truly knew what had been buried beneath the ashes, then his disappearance was not the end of a story, it was the beginning. The year 1629 returned to haunt the Duke like the toll of a funeral bell. He remembered it not as a distant tale, but as a scar that never healed. He had been a boy then, no older than Adrian was now, when the fire gutted the west wing of Ravenspire. His father, the Duke of that age, had forbidden the household to speak of what caused it. To outsiders, the tale was simple, a lightning strike, a tragic accident. But within the family, the silence was heavier than truth itself, and yet, even silence leaves echoes. The Duke recalled the way the servants whispered of screams that did not sound entirely human, the way priests refused to enter the chapel for weeks afterward, and the way his mother, pious, devout, crossed herself every time she passed the charred ruins. Something had burned in those vaults, yes, but not merely wood and stone. Something had been hidden, and in its destruction, a door had been forced open. The unsigned notes demand return what was taken gnawed at him. What had been taken in 1629, his father had gone to his grave without ever confessing. But perhaps Adrian, prying and curious, had unearthed a secret that had lain dormant for 60 years. Meanwhile, Count Matthias in Vienna could not shake the sense that the letter he received was more than a warning. He began to comb through his archives, the Hohenberg family papers, which were rife with accounts of alliances, betrayals, and wars, and there, in a collection of letters from his grandmother, he found mention of a journey, one that the Duke of Dufourt's father had made to Prague in the winter of 1628. The letter described it obliquely, as though even ink feared to betray the truth. It spoke of the learned men of the Black Circle, of a promise sealed in ash and blood, and of an object brought back across the mountains. A relic, Matthias realized, not holy, but profane, and he suspected this relic had been hidden in Ravenspire until the fire destroyed or perhaps released it. If Adrian had stumbled across traces of it, then his disappearance was no mere abduction. It was part of a story stretching across generations, one that kings and dukes alike had tried to erase. In Normandy, life at Ravenspire grew stranger by the day. Servants reported hearing footsteps in the empty west wing, though it had been sealed since the fire. Dogs howled at night, their eyes fixed on the blackened stones. The Duchess, half mad with grief, claimed she heard her son's voice calling to her from the ruins. She swore she saw his figure in the smoke that drifted from the chimneys, though no fires were lit within. Then came the night when the Duke himself, pacing through the gallery of ancestors, found a trail of soot leading from the hearth to the locked doors of the west wing. And on the door, drawn crudely in charcoal, was a mark he recognized from childhood. A circle bisected by a vertical line, flanked by two smaller crosses. It was the same mark he had seen burned into the stone floors after the fire of 1629. He ordered the mark scrubbed away, but by morning it had returned, darker and deeper than before. In Paris, the whispers grew louder. Courtiers speculated that the Duke had fallen out of favor with the king, that the heir was dead, and that Ravenspire was cursed. Some laughed, others prayed, but in the salons of Paris, nothing spread faster than scandal. A Jesuit scholar named Father Berard took particular interest in the tale. He wrote in his journal, "The Dufort line has long courted shadows. If the boy has vanished, it is not the work of men alone. There are old compacts in France, older even than the throne. The house of Dufort is but one keeper of them. Should the heir uncover what sleeps beneath stone and ash, then all Europe may yet tremble." Those words were never published, for Father Berard vanished soon after. His journal, however, survived, hidden in a convent near Lyon, and in it lay the suggestion that Adrian was not merely lost, but taken, claimed, perhaps, by the very force his ancestors once bargained with. The Duke's desperation turned to paranoia. He doubled the guards, forbade entry to the chapel, and ordered the west wing bricked up entirely. But the masons refused, swearing they felt a presence in the stone, hands upon their shoulders when no one stood behind them. One mason fell from the scaffolding to his death, and the rest abandoned the work, muttering prayers as they fled the castle gates. And still the note's command echoed in his mind, "Return what was taken in 1629. But what if what was taken was no longer an object? What if it was a soul? The Duke began to sleep little, if at all. Night after night he stalked the corridors of Ravenspire with a lantern in hand, his shadow stretching long against the walls. The great hall, once filled with laughter and the glow of torches, now felt like a tomb. His servants avoided him, for his temper had grown violent, and his eyes, once cold and calculating, now looked haunted, as though he saw things that others could not. On one such night, when the castle lay wrapped in silence, the Duke heard a sound that froze the blood in his veins, the faint voice of a child, singing. The melody drifted down from the ruined west wing, soft and broken, like a lullaby remembered from long ago. He raised his lantern and followed the sound. His boots crunched upon soot, still clinging to the stones after 6 decades. The air smelled faintly of burnt flesh, though no fire had touched those halls since 1629. At the threshold of the sealed wing, he stopped. The door was barred, thick oak reinforced with iron. Yet the singing continued, and this time he recognized the voice. It was Adrian, his son. "Adrian," he called, his voice cracking with a desperation that surprised even him. The singing ceased. A moment of silence passed, so complete it seemed the whole castle held its breath. Then, softly, a reply came. "Father, return it." The lantern slipped in his hand, the flame sputtering. His heart thundered, "Return what? Tell me where you are." But no further answer came. Only the sound of weeping, fading into silence, until nothing remained but the moan of the wind through the ruined stones. The next morning, the Duke sent riders across France, searching for scholars, priests, anyone who might interpret what haunted his castle. Few came. Those who did often left after a single night, pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One old Benedictine monk from Rouen dared to stay long enough to walk the burned halls. He traced the symbols scorched into the stone and shook his head gravely. "These are not of God," he whispered. "They are older than Rome, older than Christ. Your family bound itself to powers that should not be named. If the child is calling from there, he is no longer only your son." The Duke struck him, enraged at the suggestion. But deep in his heart, he feared the monk spoke the truth. Far away in Vienna, Count Matthias uncovered more. Among his grandmother's papers, he found correspondence between the Duforts and a Bohemian alchemist named Jan Kral, a man condemned by the church for sorcery. The letters hinted at a covenant of protection, sealed with an heir as witness. The Duforts had gained wealth and survival during the 30 Years' War. Matthias realized, not by fortune or clever politics, but by bargaining with forces conjured in Prague's hidden chambers. But the covenant had a price. Every covenant does. Matthias began to suspect that Adrian, curious and unafraid, had stumbled upon records of this pact, and those who profited from it, whether mortal or not, could not allow the boy to live freely with such knowledge. Back at Versailles, whispers reached the king's ears despite the Duke's efforts at silence. Louis XIV, though he basked in the image of divine glory, was deeply superstitious. He consulted secretly with astrologers, physicians, and even charlatans, hoping to preserve his health and rule. When he heard of Adrian's vanishing, and of the strange happenings at Ravenspire, he summoned his most trusted advisor, the enigmatic Madame de Maintenon. "They say the child walks in places he should not," Louis murmured. Madame de Maintenon lowered her gaze. "Sire, the house of Dufort has long carried a shadow. Perhaps now it reveals itself. Perhaps the boy is only the first." Louis shivered, though the fire in his chamber roared bright. For in the heart of Versailles, a place gilded with splendor, the king feared shadows most of all. The Duke, however, had grown desperate enough to act. One stormy night, he ordered the doors to the west wing unsealed. With only 2 guards at his side, he descended into the blackened ruins, where even servants refused to tread. The air was thick with soot, and the faint, acrid smell of smoke. Cobwebs hung like funeral veils. And there, in the ashes of what had once been the vaults, he found something he had not expected, a chest of iron, blackened but intact. Its lock bore the same circle and line symbol, and though 6 decades had passed, the mark seemed freshly carved. The Duke ordered it opened, but when the guards struck it with their axes, the chest groaned like a living thing. At last the lid gave way, and inside lay a bundle of cloth, scorched and crumbling, wrapped around what appeared to be Bones. Small bones. The skeleton of a child. The Duke staggered back, bile rising in his throat. And then, faintly, from the hollow chest itself, came Adrian's voice. "Return what was taken." The sight of the tiny skeleton broke what remained of the Duke's composure. He fell to his knees, lantern trembling in his grip, as his guards recoiled in horror. The bones were brittle, blackened, but unmistakably human. A child, no older than Adrian himself, yet how could a child's remains lie sealed in an iron chest beneath the ruins of Ravenspire, untouched since 1629? The Duke's mind clawed at the possibilities. Was it one of his ancestors' children, sacrificed to whatever covenant had been forged? Was this the price of the family's prosperity, the blood of its own heirs, hidden away as payment to forces no priest dared name? His father's silence suddenly made sense. The fire had not destroyed the relic, it had concealed the evidence of a bargain struck in shadows. And now Adrian, curious, relentless, had uncovered the trail. "Your Grace," one guard whispered, his voice shaking, "we should bury it, give it peace." But before the Duke could reply, the lantern flickered. The air grew colder, heavy with a suffocating stillness. Then, from the ashes around the chest, faint shapes began to rise, smoke twisting into forms half seen, half felt. Children's voices whispered in unison, their words echoing through the ruined vault. "Return what was taken, return us." The guards fled in terror, their footsteps pounding back up the stair. The Duke remained frozen, unable to tear his eyes away as the smoke thickened into the vague outline of a boy. His features were indistinct, shifting like a reflection in water, yet the Duke recognized him instantly. "Adrian." "Father," the figure said. Though its voice was not only his son's, it was layered, many voices woven together, the cry of generations. "You cannot keep us hidden. The covenant is broken. The blood calls for reckoning." The Duke reached out, desperate to touch him, but his hand passed through smoke. The figure dissolved, leaving only the echo of its command, "Return what was taken." For days afterward, the Duke locked himself away, refusing counsel, refusing food. The servants whispered that his hair had turned whiter in a single night. He spent hours in the family archives, searching records for 1629, for Prague, for anything that might tell him what had been stolen. But page after page had been stripped from the ledgers, entire sections burned away. It was Isabel, the maid who had vanished, who provided the next clue. One evening, as the Duchess sat alone in her chambers, she swore she saw Isabel standing in the corner, pale and silent. Before the lady could scream, the girl spoke. "He is not gone, my lady. He is between." The Duchess froze. Between the covenant and the curse, between the living and the ashes. Isabel's eyes glistened black in the candlelight. "But he waits for what was taken to be returned. Only then can he cross." And with that, the girl faded into shadow, leaving the Duchess trembling and clutching her rosary. When she told the Duke, he raged that it was a delusion, but inside he knew the truth. The covenant had not been destroyed in the fire. It lingered, and now Adrian was caught in its snare. Meanwhile, Count Matthias in Vienna pieced the puzzle together with growing dread. The letters from the Bohemian alchemist mentioned a substitute heir, one given in exchange for protection. The bargain had required the Duforts to surrender not their lands, nor their wealth, but their children, one child in every generation, hidden, erased from the family records. The child in the chest had been one such offering. A boy or girl sacrificed, sealed away to fulfill the pact. But somehow, in 1629, the ritual had gone awry. The fire, the screams, the panic, it was the covenant tearing at its chains. Perhaps the relic, the bones, had been meant to remain untouched, never to be seen by mortal eyes again. And now, Adrian had stumbled upon the truth. Matthias realized with horror what the letter meant. The dead remember, even if you do not. The covenant was not broken, it was waiting, and Adrian was its price. The Duke, desperate and half-mad, resolved to act. He summoned priests from Paris, men of courage and learning, to exorcise the West Wing. Holy water was sprinkled, chants were raised, incense burned until the air choked. Yet each prayer was answered with a mocking echo, a laughter like children's voices ringing in hollow stone. One priest collapsed, bleeding from the ears, his dying gasp a single word: return. That night, the Duchess dreamt of Adrian again. He stood at the foot of her bed, eyes dark as obsidian, his lips pale. "Mother," he whispered, "they will not let me go." And when she woke, she found soot upon her pillow, as if the boy had stood there in truth. The Duke at last confessed to Matthias, writing in secret, "If it is true that our line bargained with Prague, then we are damned. Tell me, can a soul once given ever be returned?" But Matthias had no answer, for even in the darkest annals of Europe's hidden histories, few dared to write of bargains sealed in blood and ash. All that remained certain was this: Adrian had not vanished. He had been claimed. The Duke's letter reached Vienna in the dead of winter, carried by a courier who swore he felt unseen, eyes watching him along every mile of the journey. Count Matthias received it in his candlelit study, the wax seal cracked with trembling hands. He read the Duke's words once, twice, then a third time, his unease growing with every line. Can a soul once given ever be returned? Matthias set the letter down and stared into the fire. He knew enough of Europe's whispered histories to understand the weight of that question. In Prague, in the decades before the fire at Ravenspire, there had been circles of learned men, alchemists, astrologers, and magi, who claimed to commune with powers older than Christendom itself. They promised protection, prosperity, knowledge, beyond reckoning. But their bargains always required a toll. And the toll, it seemed, was blood. Meanwhile, in Ravenspire, the Duke's paranoia reached fever pitch. Guards patrolled the corridors with torches at all hours, yet still they whispered of doors opening on their own, of children's laughter echoing in empty halls, of icy fingers brushing their skin. One by one, the bravest among them deserted, vanishing into the night without claiming wages. The Duchess grew paler each day, her health failing under the weight of grief. Her ladies spoke of her wandering the halls in her nightdress, whispering Adrian's name, pressing her ear against walls as if listening for a heartbeat within the stone. Some claimed she stopped eating, convinced that if she fasted, if she suffered, perhaps God would return her son. Others believed she no longer prayed to God at all, but to something else. And through it all, the Duke clung to his obsession. He returned again and again to the chest in the West Wing, staring at the bones within as though they might answer him. He tried burning them, burying them, even casting them into the sea, but always, by morning, the chest reappeared in the vault, sealed once more, its lock unbroken. It was then that Father Antoine arrived, a Dominican priest with a reputation for confronting heresy. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to pierce through lies, Antoine came not at the Duke's summons but at the urging of Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV's confidant. The king, though outwardly dismissive of superstition, wanted answers. The Duke received him with suspicion, but desperation outweighed pride. He led Antoine into the West Wing, lantern light quivering across charred stone. When the chest was revealed, the priest knelt before it, tracing the scorched symbol with a finger. "This mark," Antoine murmured, "I have seen before, in manuscripts forbidden by Rome. It is the seal of an ancient covenant, invoked to bind souls in exchange for worldly gain. But such bargains cannot be broken by man's will alone. The blood of one child may call the protection, but the debt spreads across generations." The Duke's face blanched. "Then Adrian is claimed," the priest said gravely, "unless you fulfill what was promised." The Duke staggered back. "You mean another child? No, I will not sacrifice my blood." Antoine looked at him coldly. "Then the covenant will take more than your blood. It will take your name, your house, your legacy. The Duforts will vanish, as surely as your heir has vanished now." In Vienna, Matthias's research reached a chilling conclusion. In his grandmother's letters, he found reference to a prophecy spoken by one of the Prague alchemists. The line of Dufort shall stand so long as the covenant is honored, but should an heir learn what lies beneath ashen bone, he will be neither living nor dead, he will dwell between until the balance is restored. Adrian was not gone. He was trapped, caught between life and death, servant and victim, heir and offering. Matthias knew then that the Duke's question had only one answer. A soul once given could not be reclaimed, not without another soul in its place. The Duchess, fevered and half-mad, dreamt again of her son. This time, he stood not at the foot of her bed but beside her, his hand brushing hers, his skin cold as stone. "Mother," he whispered, "I am waiting. Return it, and I will be free." Tears streamed down her face. "What? Must we return, Adrian? Tell me." His dark eyes fixed on hers. "A child for a child, as it has always been." When she woke, she found soot smeared across her hand, as though he had truly touched her. The Duke now faced an impossible choice. To honor the covenant meant condemning another innocent to the fate that had claimed Adrian. To defy it meant risking the destruction of his house, perhaps even his soul. He stood in the great hall, staring up at the portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes watching, their lips curved in knowing silence. How many of them had made the same choice before him? How many heirs had been quietly erased, their existence buried with bones in iron chests? The truth was clear. The House of Dufort had been built not on honor or loyalty, but on sacrifice. Adrian had uncovered that truth. And now he was its prisoner. The Duke whispered to the empty hall, his voice cracking, "What is nobility, if it is bought with the blood of our own children?" And from the shadows of the West Wing came the answer, soft and mocking, "It is the only kind that endures." The Duke's sanity frayed like a worn tapestry. He drank heavily, muttering to himself as though arguing with unseen companions. Servants whispered that he had taken to speaking with the portraits of his ancestors in the gallery, demanding answers from the painted eyes that stared back in eternal silence. Sometimes, when he left the hall, they swore his shadow did not match his step, that it lagged, twisting, as though pulled by some invisible weight. The Duchess, meanwhile, withdrew into her chambers entirely. She refused visitors, even her confessor, and when food was brought to her, it was often returned untouched. Rumor spread among the ladies that she had taken to fasting in an attempt to bargain with heaven. Yet others whispered she prayed not to God, but to the spirits of the children sacrificed before Adrian, begging them to release her son. And still the West Wing groaned at night, as though the ruins themselves breathed. Father Antoine, relentless in his inquiries, insisted on one final ritual, a mass within the ruined chapel of Ravenspire, where the vaults beneath had once been sealed. Against the Duke's protests, he gathered what remained of the household, priests and servants alike, to witness. Candles were lit, incense swung, and the air filled with the scent of burning myrrh. The Duke stood at the back, pale and sweating, clutching a flask of brandy. The Duchess, wrapped in a black veil, clutched her rosary until her knuckles bled. When Antoine raised the host, the candles guttered violently. A low hum filled the chapel, not unlike the toll of distant bells. Then the walls began to whisper, hundreds of voices, children and adults alike, murmuring in languages forgotten. Some servants fell to their knees, others fled screaming. Adrian's voice rose above the rest. "Father!" The Duke's head snapped up. His son's figure shimmered in the flickering light, standing at the altar beside Antoine. He looked as Adrian always had, slight of frame, sharp-eyed, but his gaze was hollow, black as ink. "Father," Adrian repeated, "it is time." The Duke staggered forward. "Time for what, Adrian? Tell me what to do." Adrian's lips curled into something between a smile and a grimace. "You know, return what was taken." The chest appeared again that night, placed in the center of the great hall as though it had been carried there by unseen hands. The servants refused to touch it, crossing themselves as they passed. Only the Duke approached, his breath shallow, his hands shaking, He knelt before it, pressing his forehead to the iron lid. "What was taken," he whispered, "was not mine to return." But the chest groaned, its hinges shuddering. Slowly, the lid lifted of its own accord. Inside lay the same small skeleton, but now the bones were not alone. Resting against them was something new, a rosary, silver and blackened, its beads worn smooth by years of prayer. The Duchess's rosary. The Duke's stomach dropped. He rushed to his wife's chambers, but found them empty. On her pillow lay soot, smeared in the shape of a child's hand. She had gone willingly. In the days that followed, Adrian appeared again, but only to the Duchess's attendants. They swore he looked whole, his cheeks flushed with life, his eyes bright as before. He kissed his mother's hand, they said, and told her he was free. Yet when they tried to approach, he vanished, leaving only the smell of smoke. The Duke, crushed by grief, refused to speak of her. He wandered Ravenspire aimlessly, muttering prayers to saints who would not answer. His power at court began to wane, as rumors of the curse spread unchecked. The Sun King, always wary of scandal, distanced himself. Count Matthias received one final letter from his cousin, written in a shaky hand. "The covenant is appeased, but at a cost I cannot bear. Adrian walks again, but he is not as he was. His laughter rings hollow, his eyes watch me with knowledge no child should carry. My wife is gone, I fear soon I will follow. If there is a God, may he forgive the house of Dufort. If not, then let history judge us." It was the last letter ever sent from Ravenspire. Years later, travellers passing the cliffs of Normandy told strange tales. Some swore they saw a boy standing at the castle windows, staring out at the sea, though the halls had long since fallen silent. Others claimed the tolling of children's laughter still drifted down from the west wing when the wind was right, and sailors whispered that on stormy nights, a woman's voice could be heard crying Adrian's name from the cliffs, only to be drowned by the crashing waves. The Duke's line eventually withered, absorbed into other houses, their names spoken only in cautionary tales. But among certain scholars, hidden in letters and diaries never meant for public eyes, the truth lingered. The house of Dufort had endured, not by loyalty to king or country, but by a covenant of blood, and when its heir uncovered that truth, he was neither lost nor saved. He was claimed, and thus, the disappearance of the Duke's heir remained a mystery on the lips of peasants and nobles alike, a story of shadows where power, sacrifice, and secrecy entwined. Some dismissed it as superstition, others as political rumor, but those who had heard the whispers in the ruins of Ravenspire knew better. The boy had vanished, yes, but what vanished can still return if the covenant wills it. By the dawn of the new century, Ravenspire Castle was a shell of its former glory. Its towers, once proud and gleaming, stood blackened against the sky. Travelers avoided its gates, claiming the air itself carried the stench of smoke, though no fires had been lit there for years. The peasants in the villages below spoke of the Duke with pity and dread. He was rarely seen, and when he was, his appearance shocked all who remembered him in his youth. His once dark hair was now white, his body frail, his eyes sunken like a man decades older than his years. But Adrian was seen often. The heir walked the castle halls, pale but whole, his step silent, his presence both comforting and unsettling. To some, he looked as though he had grown since his return. To others, he appeared unchanged, still a boy of 12, forever trapped in the moment of his disappearance. The servants whispered that when Adrian looked at you, it was not a child's eyes you met, but something vast, ancient, and cold. The Duke avoided him. At meals, he excused himself when Adrian entered. In the chapel, he prayed more fervently, though his prayers faltered whenever the boy's shadow fell across the pews. For Adrian's laughter, when it came, echoed with the hollow sound of voices layered upon voices, a reminder of every heir lost before him. At Versailles, Louis XIV had little patience for tales of curses. He dismissed Ravenspire's decline as weakness, a punishment for mismanaging one's estate. Yet even the Sun King could not silence rumor. Nobles snickered behind their fans, whispering that Adrian was a ghost raised from the ashes. or worse, a vessel for something not of this world. Some speculated that the Duchess herself had bargained her soul in exchange for her son's return. Louis, ever wary of scandal tainting his court, forbade mention of the matter in his presence. Yet Madame de Maintenon, ever discreet, warned him in private, "Sire, the boy may live, but he is not as he was. And if the covenant is true, then it binds not only his house but all who ally with it." The king shivered, though he masked it with a wave of his jeweled hand. France had no shortage of enemies, he would not count shadows among them. Still, he quietly ensured that no marriage alliances were sought with the House of Beaufort. Count Matthias, still in Vienna, received word of the Duchess's disappearance and Adrian's return. He pored over the writings of mystics, alchemists, and condemned heretics, seeking some clue as to what fate awaited the boy. One name appeared again and again: Jan Kroll, the alchemist of Prague. In a fragment of Krall's journal, preserved in secret, Matthias found the words, "The covenant binds not one heir, but the bloodline entire. The heir becomes the vessel, but through him the ancestors remain. Thus the house prospers, for all who are lost are not lost, they are gathered, waiting, within the chosen child." Matthias's blood ran cold. Adrian was not simply Adrian, he was every child the Duforts had ever surrendered. Their voices, their lives, their souls bound within him. No wonder his laughter carried more than one voice. No wonder his eyes gleamed with knowledge no child should hold. In Ravenspire, the Duke could not bear it. One night, drunk and raving, he cornered Adrian in the gallery of ancestors. "What are you?" he demanded, gripping the boy's shoulders. "Are you my son, or are you a curse in his skin?" Adrian looked up at him, calm and unblinking. "I am Adrian, and I am more than Adrian. I am the price you were too cowardly to pay." The Duke staggered back, horrified. "Then why torment me? Why return at all?" "Because the covenant is not finished," Adrian said softly. "You think my mother's gift was enough, but the debt endures, and when it is time, I will claim what is owed." The Duke collapsed, weeping, his voice breaking. "Take me then, take me instead." Adrian only smiled, with a smile far too old for his face. "It does not work that way, father. You know it." The years wore on. The Duke died alone in his chambers, his body wasted, his lips burned black as though from smoke. No priest attended him at the end. Adrian, still a boy in form though more than 20 years had passed, stood beside the bier at his funeral, his expression unreadable. Some whispered that he smiled as the coffin was lowered into the family crypt. With the Duke's death, Adrian became the new master of Ravenspire. But what was a master who did not age? What was a noble who bore within him the voices of generations sacrificed? The villagers called him l'enfant éternel, the eternal child. Nobles at court whispered that to meet his eyes was to feel the weight of centuries. And always, in the silence of Ravenspire's west wing, the chest remained, sealed, waiting. Even now, centuries later, travelers who pass the ruins of Ravenspire tell stories. They say a boy can be seen at the windows, his face pale in the moonlight, watching the sea. They say his laughter drifts on the wind, carrying with it the voices of others long dead. And they say that if you wander too close, you may hear him whisper from the shadows, "Return what was taken." The legend of Ravenspire spread far beyond Normandy, crossing borders and finding a place in the whispered folklore of Europe. Merchants traveling from Rouen to Vienna claimed to hear the tale at roadside inns, retold by sailors, soldiers, and wandering minstrels alike. Each telling grew darker, each detail more macabre. Some said Adrian had grown into a man but still bore the face of a child. Others swore he never aged at all, his appearance frozen in time, his eyes holding the weight of countless souls. What all versions agreed upon was this: the Duke's heir had not merely vanished. He had returned bearing secrets no mortal was meant to know, a vessel for the covenant that had damned his line. By the mid-18th century, Ravenspire Castle was abandoned, The last servants fled after one particularly dreadful winter when, they claimed, Adrian walked the halls by candlelight speaking with unseen companions. He was never alone, one maid testified years later. You could hear them, the whispers, the laughter, the cries of children, and yet there was only him. Travelers avoided the castle, though a few dared to enter, seeking proof of the stories. A soldier returning from the 7 Years' War swore he spent a night there and woke to find soot smeared across his chest in the shape of a child's hand. Another, less fortunate, was found at the base of the cliffs, his face frozen in terror, his eyes burned black. In Paris, philosophers of the Enlightenment dismissed the tale as peasant superstition, a story born of Catholic guilt and feudal cruelty. Yet even among them, a few admitted unease. Voltaire himself, though mocking in public, is said to have once whispered at a salon, "If the Duforts bargained with shadows, then reason will not save us from what they unleashed." Count Matthias's descendants, too, kept the records alive. They preserved the letters, the fragments of Jan Kral's writings, and the Duke's final pleas. One Hohenberg heir wrote in his diary, "The covenant was not only theirs. Every noble who trafficked with Prague carries a shadow. Perhaps Ravenspire was merely the first to crack." He did not elaborate further, and 3 months later, he was found drowned in the Danube, though no water had been near him for days. By the 19th century, Romantics embraced the legend of Ravenspire as a Gothic tale. Poets wrote of the eternal heir wandering the ruins, pale and sorrowful, his laughter echoing with the voices of the dead. Painters depicted the castle perched on storm-swept cliffs, lightning illuminating the figure of a boy at its highest tower. To the public, it was a story of tragedy and mystery, stripped of its political and spiritual implications. Yet, in certain scholarly circles, the truth was still whispered. Letters hidden in monasteries spoke of the covenant's survival. Priests in Lyon and Rouen warned one another that the Dufort bloodline had not ended, that its heirs still walked among Europe's nobility, carrying within them the covenant's price. For Adrian was never buried, no record exists of his death, no tomb, no stone. It is as though he simply continued an heir who could never inherit, a child who could never grow. And so the tale endures. The villagers of Normandy say that on stormy nights, the windows of Ravenspire glow with candlelight, though no one lives there. They say children sometimes vanish near the cliffs, drawn by the sound of laughter on the wind. And they say that if you step too close to the ruins, you may see a boy watching from the shadows, his eyes black as soot, whispering in a chorus of voices not his own, "Return what was taken." Thus ends the story of the disappearance of the Duke's heir, a tale of power, sacrifice, and secrets buried in the very stones of Europe's nobility. Some call it a legend, others a curse, but for those who listen closely, in the ruins of castles and the echoes of forgotten halls, it is a reminder: every crown is bought with blood, and some debts are never repaid.